All right. Well, I guess I'll get us started. Margaret, if you would be so kind as to begin the slideshow. But good evening, everyone. My name is Joe Rupp, and I worked with Tom Norton as the dual chairs of the Roof and Clean Energy Task Force. What we're going to do here is go through a number of items. If you go to the next slide, there's a quick review of the agenda. We're going to talk first of all about the current state of the roof. We have some information and some feedback from contractors that came out to look at our facility. We're going to take a brief foray to talk about climate change. As was mentioned earlier, this is really a great opportunity for our congregation to begin engaging explicitly in a conversation about the role that our facility plays in creating climate emissions and what we can do about it, starting with this roof project. We'll talk a little bit about the possibility of reducing our energy emissions and the different ways that we have to do that. And then we will conclude with a recommended scope of the project, the budget that we are recommending, and then some non-budgetary items as well. But as we go through this, Tom Norton and I are really gonna kind of play volleyball with the presentation responsibilities. And I'm actually gonna have Tom kick it off, talking about the current state of the roof.
Okay, thanks, Joe. On our respective subcommittees for Joe and I, we each had a couple of other team members, and Joe will talk about his in a moment, but I wanted to thank Reggie Henderson and Mike Gibson on the roof side of this. So the current state of the roof, you're looking at the building from above here, and one thing to note, it's an architectural feature of the building that's quite nice, is there's a lot of elevation changes along the roof, and so there's several places where they're little sort of turrets almost, and it's very interesting to look at. It does add complexity to the roof portion of what we're looking at, because it's effectively 42 different little roofs, some small, some large, on the top of this building. So go ahead to the next slide. Thank you. Current roof is about 25 years old. We estimated that it was installed in 95. We don't actually have any records on that. We do have the original building drawings from the 70s, but no drawings from the replacement that was done in 95. There are multiple water leaks. There's some HVAC inefficiency that the presentation will address later in the slide deck. There is pooling water, which we've got some pictures of, which doesn't help in terms of roof longevity. Water doesn't drain to the to the drains on the roof, and has to wait for it to evaporate. There are window trim issues around what are called the clear story windows that have started to rot and that are compromised. There's some side paneling that's deteriorating. Go ahead to the next slide. So some pictures from this, the pooling water that we talked about. You can see in these pictures, there's water that's collected and it's not really going anywhere, which it should. I mean, it's not a completely flat roof. It should be tapered. And maybe at one time it was, or either it wasn't done right. I'm not saying that it wasn't done right, but or it's just over time we've got areas that have sagged, and there's places where water pools, which then, the roof's not designed to have water on it all the time, and that doesn't help with a 25-year-old roof, which I'm sure has contributed to the leaking. So the next slide, please. Water's getting in other places, so this isn't really just a roof replacement. This is really the envelope of the roof area that has to be fixed. So there's places here where you can see on the windows where the trim around the windows has come loose. It's deteriorated and rotten in some places. Water gets around these points and then finds its way into the building. So that has to be part of the scope of the project, or we would waste our money because we'd still have roof leaks. So if you go on to the next slide. Opposite the windows, as you walk through the building, the opposite from what are called the clear story windows are side panels. These are just basically pieces of, they're high-end plywood that were part of the original construction techniques. And you can see that these have also failed at this point as well, rotten, and water gets in at this in these areas as well. Next slide. So as I mentioned, it's definitely a full replacement. It's not a repair or a patch. We do need to address the full building envelope, meaning it's more than just a roof. There's windows, there's trim, there's side paneling, edge boards. The taper on the roof's incorrect, as I mentioned. Water pooling, so the insulation has to be replaced. So definitely not a type of repair where we can go over the existing roof with a new layer of material. The existing one, all three contractors that we had out said it needs to be completely taken off and replaced. So go on to the next slide. I think it's Joe. Go ahead, Joe.
Okay. Well, like I said before, we do want to switch gears now and talk a little bit more about climate change. And I think we need to talk about a couple different aspects of this. The first thing that I want to mention briefly is why we as UUs, as a faith community, are called to act on climate. And then second of all, I want to explain how this roof repair is an opportunity for us to kind of take first significant steps towards reducing our own congregation's emissions. So if you go to the next slide, I think as a UU faith community, climate change is an issue that we have a responsibility to address. Our seventh principle explicitly states that we value the interdependent web of life, and we are called to act in a way that protects the planet. The reality is that climate change is the most profound ecological threat in the history of humankind. Extreme weather events like Hurricane Ida, that we've seen just this week, which devastated the Gulf Coast and then subsequently flooded out subways in New York City. Events like this are going to become more common. Fire seasons, what we're seeing in California, are going to become longer and more devastating. Same with water and food shortages worldwide. Sea levels are going to rise. Species, if you're an animal lover, species will lose habitat and go extinct because of changing climates. So without exceptions, climate change, presents the greatest test of our church's commitment to the seventh principle of UU. I also, though, think that we need to start acknowledging the social justice aspect of climate change. First UU, I think rightfully so, prides itself in its commitment to social justice and its work in combating white supremacy. The impacts of climate change will be felt everywhere, but the global poor will be hurt the most as a result of climate change, despite being the least responsible for having caused the problem to begin with. If you look at the history of emissions since the Industrial Revolution, the developed world has created 79, almost 80% of carbon emissions. But poor people living in tropical countries are more exposed to storms and extreme weather. Their housing and infrastructure is often weaker. And poor people across the globe, including here in the United States, have less savings and insurance to fall back on when disaster strikes. So, we have to acknowledge that this is not just an issue that is ecological in nature. It is an issue of economic justice, of intergenerational justice, and of social justice. And so for all of these reasons, I feel, and I think our congregation feels, called to do what we can to address it. So how do we do that? What do we do? So let's go to the next slide. the first thing that we should do as a church is we should start at home, meaning our facility. The way that our building is currently constructed, the way that it is currently powered, and the way that it is currently heated contributes to climate change. In the year preceding the pandemic, our church consumed about 134,000 kilowatts of electricity. That equates to roughly 11 and a half average US homes. Now, electricity in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but Dominion Power, who we purchase our electricity from, generates the lion's share of its power by burning coal and burning natural gas, which produces the very emissions that we need to address. The other way that our church contributes to this problem is that we heat our church by, in large part, burning natural gas. So if you think about that picture that we started with, there were those little tiny blocks, and you can look at this if you go back to the slideshow on our website, but there's these little tiny turrets, little blocks, and you can see a dot inside each of those. Those are the heating units that are housed on our roof. There's 14 of them, and 10 of them burn natural gas in order to heat our facility. That produces emissions. And then the last thing is that we are actually really inefficient with the electricity and the heat that we produce. So during this process, we did commission an energy audit on our facility. And that audit found that we're losing a large amount of the heat that we produce in the winter and a large amount of the cool air that we produce in the summer. So those leaks in the roof, and that you saw that picture of the trim peeling back from the clear story window in our facility, those issues don't just let water in, they let cool air and warm air out of our building. Which means that we are burning more gas, burning more coal, burning more fossil fuels to replace all that conditioned air that is escaping our facility. So if you go to the next slide, let's talk a little bit about what we have to do. So, I mean, the bottom line is not rocket science. We have to eliminate carbon emissions. We have to do that as a society, and we have to do that as a church. And, one of the first things that we can do is take steps towards reducing those emissions. Now, I want to be straightforward and honest with you. Getting to zero emissions is not something that we are going to do as a congregation overnight. It's not something that we're going to do in this capital campaign. Even if we work very quickly, it will take a decade or longer. But it is incredibly important that we have a unified vision as a congregation and a commitment to achieving that goal and to taking advantage of opportunities that arise to take steps in that direction. And this roof replacement provides perhaps the biggest opportunity that we've had in a long time to take a significant step. So the next couple slides are going to outline steps that we should take during this project, and that Tom and I have included in the scope of this project and the scope of our recommendations. And then I'm also briefly going to mention some things that we should do further down the road. And I don't want to get into a lot of detail with those, but I at least want to make you aware of them. Okay, so if we go to the next slide. Here are things that we can and we should do during this project to reduce our emissions. So the first thing that we should do is we should prioritize high-grade insulation being installed in the roof when we replace it. So this is a marginal additional cost, but it pays off in big ways. It pays off in big ways in terms of our energy efficiency. That is perhaps the least glamorous way that you can reduce your carbon emissions, but it is one of the cheapest and most cost effective. So making sure that when we have that roof open and we're deciding what goes on top of it, that we prioritize some of the top grade insulation that's available. The second thing that we need to do is when we replace those clear story windows that we saw pictures of, we need to prioritize replacing windows with double panes. This is a best practice in any facility. You want windows that have 2 panes because they're better at keeping cool and warm air in when you want it in, and keeping cool and warm air out when you want it out. So that is also something that we're recommending be included in the scope. And then the last piece that we're recommending is that we take this opportunity when replacing the roof to also install a rooftop solar array. Specifically what we're recommending that we do is we install an array over the Great Hall. The Great Hall is, and again, if you think back to that first photo you looked at, it's the largest swath of our rooftop that is uninterrupted by elevation changes, by different kind of chunks of the roof popping up and turrets being up there for our heating units. It is a wide open, flat landscape, which is the best place that you can put a solar array. An array in that section of the roof is projected to offset about 30 to 40% of our electrical use for our facility. That's based on several quotes that we got from solar installers that we had come out to do a site visit. If you go to the next slide, these are things that we should do in the future. I'm not going to go into great detail here, but we do need a plan to execute these over the next 10 to 15 years. They largely fall into 3 categories of continuing to increase our energy efficiency in our facility, transitioning off those gas heating units to electric heat pumps, and then sourcing the entirety of our electrical use from clean renewable sources like solar, whether that's installing additional arrays on our rooftop or sourcing it from what are called clean energy credits. Excuse me. Okay, so I'm going to pass it back to Tom now to talk about what we are recommending the kind of revised scope of this project be.
All right, so Reggie, Mike, and I, the approach we took on this, we got together first at the site, got on the roof, looked it over ourselves, and I'll just mention that we had a nice variety of experience between the 3 of us. Reggie has direct experience with roof contracting, several years of working with that in both direct roof work and in the contracting side of it. Mike is a registered architect, so deals in this business on a regular basis, and then I do facilities project management work for the Federal Reserve Bank system of Richmond, in a variety of architectural projects. As a matter of fact, we just replaced the roof on the building downtown, the Reserve Building, about 3 years ago, and I happened to run that project and work with estimators, and so those are sort of the reasons the 3 of us, I think, were picked to recommend an estimate and a scope. So we met, we talked about, looked at what's up there. We took pictures. We talked about the scope elements as we understood they should be, and then we each had some experience with contractors. We split up the duties. Went off, called our respective contractors, and then made site visits with those contractors to get their recommendations on what the scope should include, estimates, proposals for certain portions of it where it made sense. So that was the approach we took, and the recommended scope that came out of that was obviously to replace the roof, as we've already said, with a modern membrane type product. And these are usually some sort of a polymer type product, oftentimes in a roll that goes over the roof. Underneath that membrane is insulation, which it really looks like styrofoam today, and I think what was put in there 25 years ago probably is. That would be replaced with a more modern product that's called ISO. It has a much higher R value, and we would put in a thicker layer of insulation than what's there today. It would be designed to taper properly to the drains. So that would be a quality control point before any work ever began. We'd make sure that we had a design on paper that an architect had approved that that would drain properly. The deck below this insulation is going to have to be replaced in some places because we know we have leaks, and where we have leaks, this what's called tectum is we know would be damaged and would need to be replaced. So there's a scope element and a cost for that. We've already talked about the clear story windows at length. Those would be replaced along with the trim around those. The fascia, that's the piece around the edge of the building that's compromised as well. That needs to be replaced. We put in the solar over the Great Hall, as Joe alluded to earlier, including what are called solar ready stanchions. So those are really just supports for the solar panels, and that would be over the Great Hall portion only. So that's the scope. And then of course there's an estimate that we'll get to later that goes along with all of those bullets. We'll go over the estimate in detail, but at a high level, the building envelope full roof replacement portion of this is $815,000. The estimate. Again, this is not a proposal. These are estimates. And then there's a $85K on top of that for the solar array over the Great Hall. I think you could go to the next slide. Okay, so the detail on the way we built up this estimate, all three roofing contractors came in at about $350 for the actual membrane of the roof itself, to the labor and material to put down the membrane once all the other scope elements are taken care of, and that includes the insulation. So then the other pieces of this around the edge of the building will be building up for the new insulation, and we had a linear foot cost for that, and we just applied the linear feet of perimeter around the building to get the $20,000 for that element. The tectum deck was a bit of a guess. We don't know how many square feet of that we're going to have to replace, but we went with a percentage and then applied a square foot cost that we were given by one of the contractors to get the $10,000. Another big element of the scope is the windows, and we did get a couple of estimates from two different contractors, and they were 55 and 60,000 respectively, that order of magnitude. So that's where the 60K came from. So that's a pretty good number on that one. The fascia replacement is an allowance. We know it's going to be required. Don't have a direct quote on that, but we know it's not going to be zero. The stanchions, $20,000. We allowed $5 a square foot, did the math to come up with the 20K. And the 85K is an actual quote that Joe and his team got from a supplier. 100K is for the construction manager and the architect that we would need to hire in order to put the scope of the project together, create the specs, do the drawings so that we could put a package out for bid for the whole scope. And then B, what that manager architect would do is they participate during the construction in what's called a submittal and RFI process, where they're watching the construction and inspecting at various points to make sure we're getting what we paid for and that it's being installed correctly. So that's typically on a job, it's about 10 to 14% of a project. So that's where that number comes from. And then the last one is we struggled with this about how much contingency and escalation to apply. We had as much as a 50% estimate from one of the contractors. He was quite concerned about the rise in material costs that we've seen this year, particularly with COVID and shortages. Some of that looks like it's backing off a bit, so we didn't really want to go quite as extreme as 50. So we went with a 33% number for A, contingency, which would be unexpected findings or scope elements that that we haven't accounted for, and then B, to cover escalation. And then that as you can see, all adds up to 900K. Again, stressing that it's an estimate. As you go through a project, the definition of the scope gets better and better and better, and every step along the way, you get closer to knowing exactly what it's going to cost at the end. Next slide. All right, so this just summarizes the recommendations from a budget standpoint. We recommend budgeting 900K in total for the roof and the solar portions, 815 and 85 respectively, as we've said earlier. And then from the other piece of this that's very important is the project execution side of this, to make sure that it's done well and that there's no corners cut by any contractors, that we're really getting what we paid for. Inspections are done at right points before things are covered up, and we don't have leaks for a long time. And so a couple things that would be key to do that is to request that the board reconstitute the Strategic Facilities Planning Committee, and then that planning committee form a subcommittee to oversee this roof project. So that way it would be a three-pronged approach where there'd be an owner at the table, which would be the UU subcommittee. There'd be an architect, and there'd be a contractor. We call it OAC, owner, architect, contract. And that group, all with their various strengths, when those three are combined, usually you end up with a good end product. So that's what we're recommending from a project execution standpoint. And if you go to the next slide, I mentioned the members on roof subcommittee. I'll turn back over to Joe for his team members.
Yeah, so I was on the solar and clean energy side of things, and then with me was Charles Garina, who is here, I think, next to Dorothy. I can't see him anymore. There he is, and then also Michael Testerman, and yes, a huge thanks to both of those gentlemen for organizing a ton of site visits from solar companies, and Michael in particular was instrumental in getting the energy audit conducted on our facility. And that wraps up our presentation.